The knife came down on the table so hard it split the wood clean to the grain, and every man in the Dustthorn Market's central tavern went dead quiet. Ugak Grimtusk left her hand on the hilt, let the silence stretch, and then looked at the merchant who had just tried to short her payment by 6 iron weights. He was sweating through his collar. She could smell it from where she stood. "Count it again," she said. He counted it again. He came up with the right number this time. Funny how that worked. She pulled the knife free, tucked the coin purse into the front of her fitted leather vest dark brown, laced tight across her broad shoulders, and nipped close at her waist, where it met the snug stitching of her traveling pants, the whole thing worn in and supple from 100 roads. And she walked out of the tavern without looking back, because looking back was for people who were worried about what followed them. Ugak Grimtusk was not worried about that. She was 26, green-skinned and broad-shouldered, and built like something carved for a purpose, with a jaw that carried a single short tusk on the right side. The left had been clipped in a duel when she was 19, which she counted as the best thing that ever happened because it made her look asymmetrical, and that made people underestimate her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a rough braid, practical and unadorned. Her eyes were a deep amber that caught lantern light like hammered gold, and her expression, as a general rule, ran somewhere between bored and ready to cause a problem. She was the best blade courier north of the Grelk River, hired to move goods through the lawless border stretch between the human settlement of Aldenmore and the Orc clan territories further east. She had done this job for 4 years and she was very good at it. She did not need a guild. She did not need a partner. She did not need anything she couldn't carry in her own 2 hands. That was the state of things when Daniel Weston came back into her life. She heard him before she saw him. She was crossing the market square in the pale blue light of early morning, heading for the stables to check on her horse, when the sound of a lute cut through the usual din of traders and drovers, and the clang of the smithy on the east side of the square. It was a fast tune, clever and irreverent, and then a voice followed it, a low voice that knew how to carry without shouting, warm and a little rough at the edges, and whoever owned it was in the middle of a story that had the small crowd around him leaning in. And the Duke says, "You have 2 choices, either give back the gold or I'll have your ears." And the merchant says, "My lord, I spent the gold on hats, and I've grown quite fond of my ears, so perhaps we might find a third option." The crowd laughed. Ugak stopped walking. She turned slowly because she already had a suspicion, and she wanted to look at the man before he saw her. He was sitting on an overturned crate at the edge of the square, a battered lute across his knee, and he was exactly as she remembered him, somewhere around 30, lean and long-limbed, with a jaw that needed shaving and brown hair that couldn't decide which direction it wanted to go. He had the kind of face that was easy to look at, not the shining, sculpted kind that belonged in a lord's hall, but the lived-in kind, with laugh lines and a small scar through his left eyebrow and eyes the color of river water after rain. Dark gray, sometimes green depending on the sky. He was wearing a traveler's coat, worn at the elbows, and a pair of boots that had seen every road north of the Grelk River, and probably several roads she hadn't even named yet. Daniel Weston. Wandering singer, storyteller for hire, general dealer in words and trouble. She had met him 2 years ago, at a different market in a different border town, during a situation that had involved a stolen crate, a furious spice merchant, and a very badly timed rainstorm. She had pulled him out of a river because he had made the mistake of standing on a pier that was not built for the particular weight of 2 large men chasing him. He had laughed while she dragged him to shore. She had called him an idiot. He had said, "That's fair," and bought her a drink, and they had talked until the fire burned down to coals. She had thought about that conversation more than she was comfortable admitting. Then she had taken her next courier job and ridden east, and that had been that. She had not expected to find him here. He spotted her at the exact moment she decided to stop staring and go check on her horse. She saw the moment he recognized her, a little flicker of something that moved across his face fast, before it settled into a grin that was half delight and half the specific expression of a man who had just been handed a gift he wasn't expecting. He said something to the crowd, something that earned another laugh, and then he stood and crossed the square toward her, and she told herself she was not going to smile. "Ugak Grimtusk," he said. "Either this is the smallest world alive or someone upstairs has a sense of humor." "Weston," she said, and she sounded perfectly neutral, which was an achievement she was proud of. "You're alive." "I am, though not for a lack of trying on the market's part." He nodded at the tavern behind her. "I saw what you did to that merchant's table. He was being dishonest." "He was," Daniel agreed easily. "I've been watching him skin people for 3 days. You're the first one who did anything about it." He tilted his head, looking at her with that direct, clear-eyed way he had that she had never quite decided was charming or irritating. "You look well." "I look exactly the same as 2 years ago." "Yes," he said, and there was something in his tone that was simple and honest and not at all performative. "You do." She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked away, because that was the kind of statement that required a different kind of answer than she was prepared to give at 6 in the morning in the middle of a market square. "I have a horse to check on," she said. "I'll walk with you." She should have said no. She said nothing, which was essentially yes, and he fell into step beside her. And that was the second time in 2 years that Daniel Weston walked back into her world and made it immediately more complicated. The Dustthorn Market was the largest trading hub on the border stretch, and it ran day and night from the first of spring to the last gasp of autumn, when the mountain passes closed, and everyone retreated to their respective sides of the Grelk to wait out the cold. Human merchants came from Aldenmore and the coastal towns to the west. Orc traders came down from the clan territories with iron goods and furs, and the particular black salt that only came from the deep mines east of the Stoneback Ridge. Between them was a no-man's land of negotiation and occasional throat-cutting, and in the middle of it all were people like Ugak, who moved things across that divide for a price, and people like Daniel, who told stories about it for a slightly smaller price. He had been hired, he explained as they walked, by the market's administrator, a round, nervous man named Pell who wore too many rings, to provide evening entertainment for the market's main hall through the season. Daniel had been passing through on his way from a lord's court in the west, where his engagement had ended somewhat suddenly. "What did you do?" Ugak asked. "I told a story about a lord who confused bravery with cruelty." "Was it about that lord?" The story was entirely fictional. He paused. "The lord had a very specific laugh and a very specific birthmark on his chin." She looked at him sidelong. "You're lucky you still have your tongue." "I am, though it was a near thing." He said it cheerfully, the way he said most things, as if the world was a large and interesting place that kept trying to kill him and kept failing, which meant it was probably going to be fine. She found that she had missed that about him. She was not going to tell him that. At the stables, she checked her horse, a rangy dun mare named Brick, who tolerated Ugak and hated most other people, and Daniel leaned against the gate and watched her work with the easy patience of a man who was accustomed to observing. "How long are you in Dustthorn?" he asked. "Until I find a paying contract east of the ridge," she said. "A week, maybe 2. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "I mean," he said, and he was smiling now, the real one, not the performer's smile, "there's a lot of good walking between here and the ridge, and it would be a waste to not do some of it together." She did not answer immediately. She ran her hand along Brick's flank and thought about 2 years ago, about a fire burned to coals and a conversation that had covered everything from the peculiarities of Orc honor customs to the mechanics of good storytelling to the specific loneliness of being on the road for too long alone. "I walk fast," she said finally. "I've got long legs," he said, and that was settled. The Dustthorn Market sprawled across the flat where the Grelk River bent south, surrounded by the beginnings of the Stoneback foothills, and in the first days of that arrangement, Ugak doing her courier work, Daniel doing his evening shows, both of them drifting together in the spaces between, she felt something shift that she had been successfully ignoring for 2 years. He was easy to be around. That was the dangerous thing. She had spent most of her life making herself difficult to be around. not on purpose, but because she was an orc woman doing hard work in a hard world that had strong opinions about what she was supposed to want and where she was supposed to be. And she had found that being fierce and sharp and immediately willing to put a knife in a table saved a great deal of time that would otherwise be spent managing other people's assumptions. Daniel Weston did not have any assumptions, or if he did, he kept them to himself and acted instead on what he actually saw, which was apparently just her. Ugak, specific and particular and not a category. The first evening he played in the market hall, she sat in the back with a cup of rough cider and watched him work the crowd, and she had to admit to herself, privately, with no witnesses, that he was extraordinary at it. Not because of the loot, though the loot was very good, but because of the stories. He had a gift for finding the thread of a thing that was true underneath all the layers of the thing that was comfortable, and pulling it into the light just gently enough that people laughed before they realized they were feeling something they hadn't expected. He told 3 stories that first night. The third was about 2 people from opposite sides of a war who met in the middle of a destroyed bridge, and she sat up a little straighter when she heard it, because it was not quite her story, but it was near enough to make her feel seen in a way that was not entirely comfortable. After the hall emptied, he found her still at her table. "You stayed," he said, settling across from her. "I had nowhere better to be." That is either a compliment or the most indirect insult I have ever received. He stole a sip from her cider, which was audacious, and she let him because she was curious what she'd do about it, and apparently the answer was nothing. "What did you think?" "The first one was showing off," she said. "The second was too long, the third one," she stopped. "The third one," he prompted quietly. "The third one was honest," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and the lantern between them made his eyes look more green than gray, and he said, "I'm glad you stayed," in that direct, simple way that she was starting to recognize as just who he was, no armor on it, no performance. And she picked up her cider and looked at the far wall and said, "Do not make it a thing, Weston," and he laughed and said, "Noted." And they sat there until the fire burned low, same as 2 years ago. Except this time, she knew better than to pretend she was just passing time. The contract she was waiting for came in on the 5th day. A trader named Shorn, a heavyset human man with a sun-weathered face and an honest reputation, had 12 crates of dyed wool that needed to go east through the pass to the orc trading post at Calvrak. The trouble was that the road through the pass was currently running through the territory of a clan called the Ashbone, who had opinions about human trade goods that tended to express themselves violently. Ugak took the job. She was orc. The Ashbone would deal with her. She'd done 2 runs through Ashbone territory before. It was tense but manageable. She was in the middle of loading brick the morning of her departure when Daniel appeared at the stable gate with his pack on his shoulder and his loot case across his back. She stared at him. "No, the market administrator just terminated my contract," he said. "What did you do?" "I told a story about an administrator who padded the market tolls. He had the decency to look at least somewhat sheepish. The administrator had a very specific nervous habit and a very specific collection of rings." Ugak pressed her hands against Brick's saddle and breath through her nose. "Weston, I need to get to Calvrak anyway," he said. "I've got an old contact there who owes me coin. I've made the Ashbone run twice. I know the trail at the top of the North Ridge, the one that skirts the clan checkpoint." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back steadily, not pleading, not performing, just presenting the facts and letting her decide. "You slow me down," she said, "and I leave you. Understood? You make a sound at the Ashbone checkpoint that isn't silence, and I will personally throw you into whatever tree is closest. Also understood? And you carry your own weight, all of it. I am not a pack horse. I have 2 legs and a loot and a very efficient pack," he said. "I make excellent camp food, and I know 17 different songs to pass the time. I am in most respects a tremendous asset." She swung up into the saddle. "You will need a horse. The farrier rents by the day." He was already smiling. "I'll be 10 minutes." He was 11 minutes, which she chose to let pass, and they rode out of Dustthorn into the foothills with the morning light turning the ridge above them copper and orange, and the road ahead empty and clean, and Ugak admitted to herself privately, still without witnesses, that she was glad he was there. The trail north of the Grelk was beautiful and merciless in equal measure, the way the border country tended to be. The foothills pushed up against the stoneback ridge like a crowd pressing toward a door, all limestone and spruce, and the occasional burst of wildflower in the clearings. The road was more idea than fact in places, a suggestion of direction rather than a built thing, and the horses picked their way carefully along ledges that dropped into scrubby valleys on one side and pushed up into gray stone on the other. Daniel, to his credit, was not slow and not loud and did not require rescue, which elevated him meaningfully in her estimation. He rode competently, read terrain reasonably well for someone whose primary trade was words, and had the good sense not to fill silence that didn't need filling. When he did speak, it was worth hearing. "Tell me something," he said on the first afternoon as they followed the ridge trail west of the primary pass. "You grew up near the Stoneback territory. Did you ever make this crossing as a child?" "My mother did twice a season," she said. "Trading, I came once. I was 7. She was quiet for a moment, because this was the kind of information she did not generally volunteer. "It was the first time I understood that the border actually existed. That there was a place where you were on one side or the other. What did it feel like?" She thought about it seriously because that was what honest questions deserved. "Like something was going to be asked of me that I hadn't been warned about." He nodded slowly. "I grew up in the Aldenmore settlements," he said. "Human side, obviously. I was taught that orcs didn't trade, didn't tell stories, didn't build anything that lasted. And then I came east when I was 17, and I watched an orc craftsman spend 6 hours on a single joint in a wagon frame until it was exactly right." He shook his head. "I had to rebuild everything I'd been given. Most people don't bother," she said. "Most people are lazy," he said, simply and without heat. "It's easier to keep the story you started with." She looked at him, and he was watching the trail ahead, and she felt something warm and inconvenient settle in her chest. "Don't say things like that," she said. "Like what?" "True things. It makes you harder to ignore." He turned and looked at her, and his mouth curved at the corner in a way that was not quite a smile and not quite a challenge, but was somewhere between both of those things and considerably more interesting. And he said, "I'll do my best," in a tone that suggested he wouldn't, and she turned her eyes back to the trail and decided that was his problem. They camped that night in a sheltered bend of the trail where an overhang of limestone kept the wind off, and he made the camp food he had promised, which was a simple stew of dried meat and root vegetables from his pack, and it was genuinely good, and she ate 2 portions without acknowledging that she was doing so. He played one song quietly while the fire settled, something without words, just the lute talking to itself, and she sat with her back against the stone and listened and did not pretend to be doing anything else. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked when the song was done. "The road, the market to market, lord to lord, finding the next coin." He thought about it. He was good at actually thinking before he spoke, which was rarer than it should be. "I get tired of the alone part of it," he said. "Not the road itself, but the particular quality of silence when you've been by yourself for too long and you stop expecting to hear anything back." She understood that in a way that was uncomfortably specific. "Yes," she said. He looked at her over the fire. "Do you?" "I am an orc woman doing human work in a human market," she said. "On my best days, people deal with me because I'm useful. On my ordinary days, they deal with me because they're afraid of the knife. And the people from your own side. I left the clan territories when I was 20 to work the border. That was 6 years ago." She kept her voice level. "You cannot be on both sides of a border." "That sounds lonely," he said, quietly, no pity in it, just acknowledgement. "I am not a person who needs company," she said. "No," he said, "but you're a person who deserves it." The fire cracked between them. She looked at him for a long moment, this lean, road-worn man with the scruffy jaw and the clear eyes and the habit of saying true things with no armor on them, and she felt the specific danger of him more clearly than she had yet. He was not trying to impress her. He was not afraid of her. He was not treating her as a type or a novelty or a problem to be managed. He was just looking at her, steadily and with real interest, the way you look at someone you have decided is worth seeing. She said, "Go to sleep, Weston," and pulled her bedroll over her shoulders, and she heard him shift and settle, and neither of them said anything more, and she lay awake for a long time thinking about the particular quality of silence when you stop expecting to hear anything back. The second day on the trail brought clouds and a wind from the east with teeth in it, and by midday the sky had gone the specific dark gray that the mountains used to announce they were about to make a point. "Rain," she said. "How long?" She looked at the cloud shelf. "An hour before it hits. The pass crossing is 4 hours at this pace. So we run the first section of the pass before the worst of it," he said, not asking, calculating. "And if we can't make the southern descent before dark, there's a shelter structure halfway down," she said. "Stone walls, no roof, better than nothing." They pushed the horses to a canter where the trail allowed it, and the rain caught them anyway. It always did, in the mountains, no matter what the clouds told you about timing. A hard, cold downpour that turned the trail to mud and reduced visibility to 20 feet in any direction. Ugak kept her hand on Brick's neck and her eyes on the trail markers, which were carved into the rock at intervals and were, blessedly, still legible. Then the trail crossed the bridge. It was a bridge she had used 4 times before, a timber and rope construction over a narrow gorge, wide enough for 1 horse at a time, solid enough in dry weather. She pulled up at the near side and looked at it in the rain, and what she saw made her stomach tighten. The river below, normally a manageable rush, had turned into a roaring, churning flood. 2 days of snowmelt from the high peaks had been waiting for a trigger, and the rain had provided it. The water was 20 feet below the bridge deck, which would have been fine except that the left anchor ropes, the main ones, were fraying where they met the rock socket, the fibers shredding under the strain of water and weather, and she could see the timber deck buckling slightly in the middle, a slow bend downward that meant the whole structure was losing its tension. "The bridge is failing," she said. Daniel came up beside her and looked. "How long does it have?" "Minutes, maybe less." She scanned the gorge. There was no other crossing she knew within a reasonable distance. Below, a 50-foot flooded gorge with walls that offered no descent. Ahead, the rest of the pass and Shorn's 12 crates of wool and her reputation and her contract. "1 horse at a time," she said. "Fast." "You first," he said immediately. "You're heavier. If the deck holds you, it holds the rented hack." She looked at him. He was soaking wet and matter-of-fact about it. "If it goes while I'm on it, then I'll do something stupid and brave to help you," he said. "Go." She did not have time to argue, which she suspected he had calculated. She pressed her heels into Brick's sides, and the mare, brave and stupid like all good horses, went. The bridge groaned when Brick's hooves hit the deck. It swayed in a way that structures were not supposed to sway, a deep, rolling movement that Ugak felt through her whole body, and she leaned forward and kept her eyes on the far side and kept Brick moving at a controlled canter rather than a panicked gallop, because a panicked gallop would break the rhythm of the planks. The gorge roared below her. Wind hit her sideways. The left anchor rope, she could hear it, was talking now, individual fibers snapping with small, sharp cracks that cut through the rain. Brick reached the far side and lunged up the bank, and Ugak spun her immediately and looked back. Daniel was already on the bridge. He was keeping his horse to a trot, controlled and deliberate, which was the right call, and he was watching the deck and not the water below, which was also right, and he was most of the way across when the left anchor rope gave. Not all at once. In stages, which was in some ways worse. The bridge deck tilted sharply to the left, the right side rising, the whole structure rotating around its now single anchor axis, and Daniel's horse screamed and stumbled, and Daniel went sideways in the saddle and grabbed the rope rail on the high side, and his horse scrambled and found the deck again and kept moving. And the bridge was still rotating, still going, and Ugak was off brick and had her rope out. The courier's rope she carried for exactly the kinds of situations that weren't supposed to happen. And she threw one end toward the bridge with everything she had. Daniel caught it. He looped it around his wrist once, held his horse's reins in the other hand, and when the bridge finally let go, the right anchor failing half a second after the left, the whole structure dropping into the gorge with a sound like a giant clearing its throat. His horse had just cleared the end of the deck, and his feet hit solid ground one instant before the bridge was simply gone. The rope went slack. The gorge roared. The rain came down. Daniel stood on the bank, still holding both his horse's reins and her rope, completely drenched, and he looked at where the bridge had been, and then he looked at her. "Well," he said. She crossed to him in 3 strides, grabbed the front of his coat, and felt relief, sharp and immediate and completely out of proportion to what they were to each other, which was apparently a lie she had been telling herself for 2 years, because it hit her with the force of something true. And she looked at him and he looked at her, and he said quietly, "Hey, I'm here." She released his coat and stepped back. Her hands were steady. "Good. You almost went in," she said. "Almost," he agreed. "But I didn't. Because I had a rope. Because you threw it in exactly the right direction at exactly the right moment," he said, "which is not nothing, Ugak." She had not given him permission to use her first name without the second, and she was aware that she did not correct him, and they looked at each other in the rain for a moment that stretched long enough to be about something more than a bridge. Then she turned and found the shelter. It was as she remembered. 3 stone walls and a floor and no roof, but deep enough that they got the horses under cover and could sit out of the worst of the rain, with a small fire that she coaxed from the dry wood that someone had sensibly left stacked in the corner. Daniel sat with his back against the stones and wrung water from his coat and did not complain, which was possibly the most impressive thing about him. She sat across the fire from him and peeled off her wet leather vest to dry it by the heat. She wore a fitted linen shirt beneath it, now also damp, and was looking at the fire when she heard him not speaking. She looked up. He was looking at her, and then he looked at the fire, and his jaw was set in the deliberate way of a man not saying something. "Say it," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were composing something. Your mouth does a thing when you're composing something." He looked at her again, and this time he didn't look away. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that for the second time in 2 years you have pulled me out of something I couldn't get out of myself, and that I have been very bad at actually telling you what that means." She kept her expression neutral. "I have good instincts and a rope." "You have good instincts and a rope, and you were watching me on that bridge before you even knew you were watching me," he said. "You were already moving before it started to go." He held her gaze across the fire. "I notice you, Ugak. I'd like you to know that." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain came down hard on the exposed floor of the shelter where they weren't sitting, drumming on stone. "That is an extremely inconvenient thing to say," she said. "I know." He was not apologizing for it. She picked up her vest and turned it toward the heat, and she said without looking at him, "I notice you too, since you seem to be in the business of saying things we don't take back." She heard him breathe. She did not look at him. The fire worked on the wet leather. After a moment he said softly, "Good," and they sat in the warmth of the shelter while the mountain rain hammered the world outside, and the silence between them was not the kind that she had been afraid of, the kind that came from being alone too long. It was the other kind, the kind that meant someone was there. The rain broke before dawn. They made the southern descent in the cold, clear morning and reached the valley floor by midday, and the Kalvrak trading post appeared in the afternoon light, a cluster of permanent structures, stone-based with timber upper stories, surrounded by the seasonal camps of traders from a dozen different clans and at least 6 different human settlements. It was smaller than Dustthorn but older, and it ran on different rules, orc rules primarily, which meant that loud arguments were conducted in the open and quiet agreements meant considerably more. They delivered Shorn's wool to the Kalvrak factor without incident, collected the second half of Ugak's fee, and she tucked the coin into her vest with the satisfaction of a completed thing. Daniel found his old contact, a weathered orc trader named Brack, who greeted him with the kind of enthusiasm that confirmed they had a genuine history, and collected what sounded like a meaningful debt repayment, which he pocketed without fanfare. They ate dinner at the post's common table, and it was a good meal, orc style, heavy on roasted meat and the flat bread that was cooked on heated stones, and Daniel ate with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who appreciated food on its own terms, without making it a statement about what he was. The other traders at the table watched him without staring, which was the polite orc approach to something unusual. An unaccompanied human male eating without looking over his shoulder was a curiosity here. One of the traders, an older orc woman with the silver-streaked hair of someone who had decided to be exactly as much as she was, looked at Ugak across the table and then back at Daniel, and then at Ugak again with an expression that required no translation. Ugak did not respond to that expression. She poured herself more of the thick brown ale and listened to Daniel tell Brack the story of the bridge. He told it well. He always told things well. But the version he told was not the version she would have told. In his version, she was the one who was remarkable, the weight and speed of the throw, the read of the bridge's failure before it happened. He did not make himself the hero or the fool. He made it a story about competence and trust and being in the right place with the right person, and Brack listened with his arms crossed and then looked at Ugak with something that was not quite assessment but in that neighborhood. "This one's useful," Brack said, tilting his head at Daniel. "He has his moments," Ugak said. Daniel looked at her sidelong and his mouth did the thing at the corner and she looked at her ale. That night the post assigned them adjacent rooms in the timber upper story, small and clean with narrow beds, and the smell of pine resin in the boards. Ugak was sitting on the edge of her bed working oil into the leather of her vest when there was a knock on the shared wall, one knuckle, quiet. She crossed to the door between the rooms. There was one, a working latch which she had been aware of and had not moved the hook on and opened it. He was standing in the doorway in his undershirt and his rode trousers with his feet bare on the floor, and he had his lute in his hands and he said, "I'll play something quiet, if you want company." She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight. She was very aware that she had been sitting in her room thinking about knocking on that wall first, which was a thing she was not going to tell him. She opened the door wider and stepped back. He came in and sat in the chair by the small hearth and played the quiet lute again, the wordless kind, and she sat on the bed with her back against the wall and listened, and after a while she said, "When did you learn to play?" "My father," he said, still playing. He was a mill worker, not a wealthy man, but he had the lute and the theory that anything could be survived if you had the right song for it. He was quiet for a moment. "He died when I was 15. "Fever, I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "He was a good man, I try to be." He said it without self-consciousness. "Not always successfully, but I try." "What happened to your mother?" "Still in Aldenmore," he said. "Running the mill, remarried to a decent man. She's fine." He smiled a little. "She thinks I should settle somewhere. She says it with increasing urgency every time I write." "And your son?" she asked because she had noticed. When Brack greeted him, something had passed between them, a question Brack had asked and Daniel had answered with a nod and 2 words, and she had filed it away. The lute went quiet. He set it across his knees and looked at her directly, which she appreciated. No evasion. "His name is Tam," Daniel said. "He's 8. His mother and we were young, we were on the same road for a season. It was one of those things. She's a good person. She lives in Kalvrak now, which is part of why Brack was able to reach me easily. She has custody of Tam because she has a fixed home and I have a road. We have an arrangement." He held her gaze. "Tam spends time with me when I'm in the area. A week here, a few days there. I write to him, I send coin." Something moved in his face, complicated and honest. "It is the thing I am most trying to get right." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is he well?" Daniel's expression softened in a way she had not seen before, something open and unguarded. He's extraordinary. He's got his mother's stubbornness and my mouth, which is a terrifying combination. He reads everything he can get his hands on. He builds things. Last season he built a working water wheel in the creek behind the house, and it powered a little mill he made out of sticks. He shook his head with an affection that was so genuine it filled the room. He's 8 years old and he's already better at half the things I do. She listened to him talk about his son, and she watched his face, and she felt something turn over in her chest that was not complicated and not inconvenient but simply warm, because this was what he looked like when he loved something without reservation, and it was very good to see. "Does he know you're here?" she asked. "His mother sent a note to the post when she knew I was coming through the area," Daniel said. "Tam's supposed to come to the post tomorrow for 2 days." He paused. "If that's a problem for you, I can—" "Why would it be a problem?" she said evenly. "Not everyone wants the complication," he said, "just the facts, no accusation in it." "You told me your true things," she said, meeting his eyes. "I told you mine. That is not a complication. It is just the shape of a life." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're remarkable, you know that." "I know that," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved, and he smiled, and it broke the tension in the room into something easier, and she said, "Play the quiet lute until I fall asleep, Weston," and he did. Tam arrived at midday the next day. He came with his mother, a compact, dark-haired human woman named Sella, who had warm eyes and the specific expression of someone who was more interested in her child's happiness than in relitigating old territory. She and Daniel exchanged a few words privately, brief and civil and adult, and then Sella looked at Ugak with open curiosity and not hostility, said, "He talks well of you," and left Tam for 2 days. Tam was small for 8, with his father's coloring and his mother's dark eyes, and a kind of focused intensity about him that reminded Ugak of a much smaller version of a person who had already decided on the important things. He had a book under one arm and a wood-carved animal in his pocket that she could see the tail of, and when Daniel brought him over to introduce her, Tam looked at her with the uncomplicated assessment of a child who had not yet been taught to make it complicated. "This is Ugak," Daniel said. "She's the best blade courier on the border road. She saved my life on the bridge yesterday." Tam looked at her. She looked at him. "How?" he asked. "Rope throw," she said. "How far?" 15 feet, maybe 16. Fast. He was already going sideways. Tam processed this. "Could you teach me to throw a rope like that?" Daniel started. "Yes," Ugak said. The boy's face opened. He looked at his father briefly, with the particular expression of a child who has just secured something before the adult system could say no, and Daniel pressed his mouth together over a laugh and gestured toward the post's outer yard. She spent an hour with the boy in the yard, working through the mechanics of a proper throw, the grip and the coil and the weight of the rope's lead end, and how the body needed to turn to get the distance. Tam was a quick learner, quicker than she expected, precise and patient with himself in a way that some adults weren't. And by the end of the hour, he could put the lead into a bucket at 12 feet with reasonable consistency. He was very pleased about this. Daniel sat on a fence rail at the edge of the yard and watched, and she was aware of his eyes on her the whole time but did not make anything of it, because teaching a child to throw a rope was not a loaded activity, and she was going to treat it as the ordinary thing it was. Then Tam, in the way of 8-year-olds who had accomplished something they were proud of and were therefore briefly unguarded, turned to her and said, with the total simplicity of it, "You're really beautiful." And Ugak went completely still, not because the words surprised her, though they did, but because of what was inside them. Not the kind of thing adults said, loaded with motive or politics or the complicated weight of crossing a border that was supposed to stay closed. Just a child's honest perception, stated with no agenda, the way you would note that the sky was a particular shade of blue or that a horse was a particularly good horse. She was beautiful. That was simply what he saw. She had been called many things in her life. useful, dangerous, strange, intimidating. Occasionally, by people who meant something more complicated by it, she had been called striking or arresting, which were the words people used when they wanted to acknowledge something without committing to what it meant. She had never been called beautiful by someone who had no reason to say anything else. She stood in the yard with the rope in her hands, and she felt something happen in her chest that she could not have named precisely, something that had to do with the specific quality of being seen without the weight of everything that was usually attached to it, and she did not know what to do with that. And so, for a moment, she simply did nothing. Daniel, on the fence rail, had gone quiet too. She could feel it without looking. Then Tam added, with the businesslike air of someone who has made his point and is ready to return to the task, "Can we do the 15-foot throw now?" she breathed. She looked at the boy. She said, "Yes," in a voice that was carefully level and mostly succeeded. She did not look at Daniel until after, when Tam had run off to find a better bucket to aim at, and then she looked at him, and his expression was something she had no word for, soft and sure and full of something she had been pretending not to want since the first time they sat across a fire from each other 2 years ago. He got down off the fence rail and crossed the yard to her and stopped close, closer than casual, and he said, very quietly, "He's right, you know." She looked at him. He was looking at her the same way Tam had, without the agenda, without the loaded weight, just seeing her. "Children say what they see," she said, and her voice did something she hadn't given it permission to do, something small and uncertain, and she hated it slightly and leaned into it anyway. "They do," he said. "It's one of the best things about them." He reached out and touched her jaw with 2 fingers, barely a touch, careful and asking. "I've been thinking it since the first morning in Dustthorn." She should have had something sharp to say. She had been keeping sharp things ready for exactly this kind of moment. All the reasonable objections, all the ways this was complicated and cross-border and impractical, and a bad idea by any rational measure. She said none of them. She put her hand on his chest. She could feel his heartbeat through the linen, faster than usual, and she leaned in the remaining inch and kissed him. It was not tentative. She was not a tentative person. It was firm and warm and tasted like the morning's black tea and something that was just him, and he made a small sound against her mouth, and his hand came up and curved around the back of her neck, and they stood in the middle of the post yard with the afternoon light coming down hard and bright, and it was the best thing she had felt in a very long time. When they stepped back, she looked at him. Her expression was, she suspected, something more open than she was used to wearing. "Right," he said, and he was slightly breathless, which she found deeply satisfying. "Right." He looked at her for another moment. "I've wanted to do that since the bridge." "You should have done it sooner," she said. He laughed, the real one, and shook his head, and she turned back to the yard and called Tam back for the 15-foot practice, and Daniel went back to his fence rail, and the afternoon continued in the good, specific way of an afternoon in which something irreversible and entirely correct has just happened. Those 2 days in Calvrack were, by any honest accounting, among the best she had had in years. Tam was a relentless presence, in the best way curious about everything, including her, asking the kinds of questions that children ask, which are either devastating in their accuracy or completely delightful in their absurdity, and she answered all of them straight, which he seemed to appreciate. He wanted to know how an orc became a courier. He wanted to know if she had ever been in a real fight. He wanted to know if Brick was the fastest horse she had ever owned, and when she said probably not, he wanted to know which was faster and why. And they had a detailed conversation about horse conformation that surprised Daniel and did not surprise Ugak, because she had been thinking about horses seriously for her whole working life. She heard Daniel tell Tam a story before bed on the second night, through the wall of her room, not the words but the shape of it, the rhythm of his voice going easy and unhurried. It was a long story. She heard Tam interrupt it 3 times to ask questions, and she heard Daniel answer each one without irritation, and she lay in her bed with one arm behind her head, and felt the warmth of the rooms around her like something she had not expected. On the morning Sela came back for Tam, the boy hugged his father and then turned and hugged Ugak, which she had not been prepared for, small arms around her middle, his head at her ribs, and she put one hand on the top of his head, awkward and careful, and he looked up at her and said, "Will you be here next time?" She looked at Daniel over the boy's head. He was watching her, no pressure in it, just looking. "I'll be around," she said to Tam. The border roads don't change. Tam accepted this with the practicality of a child who had learned not to expect promises that were too exact, and he went with his mother, and Sela looked at Ugak before she left and gave a small, single nod, and Ugak gave one back, and that was that. She and Daniel stood in the post yard in the morning quiet. "Thank you," he said. "For," he made a gesture that covered the rope throwing and the conversation and the 2 days of it. "He's easy to spend time with," she said. "He thinks in straight lines." "He does, it's a gift." She looked at the road. She had a return contract to collect in Dustthorn, a merchant there who needed iron goods moved back west, which made the timing logical and the direction shared. She had not mentioned this yet. "My return contract runs through Dustthorn," she said. He looked at her. Then he smiled slowly, and it was the kind of smile that knew exactly what she wasn't saying and was choosing not to point it out directly, which she appreciated. "My contract in Dustthorn is terminated," he said, "but I have enough coin now to manage for a while. I thought I might head west eventually, see if there's work at the Thornwall Festival." "The Thornwall Festival is in Dustthorn's district," she said. "Is it?" he said. "It is." She picked up Brick's reins. "The road goes faster with 2 riders, safer through the ridge with the bridge gone. There's a lower trail," he said, "longer but passable." "I know the lower trail." "Then we'll take that one," he said, and the word "we" landed in the air between them like something they were both standing next to and looking at with satisfaction, and she swung up onto Brick and looked down at him and said, "I leave in 10 minutes, and he said, 9, and she said, 8, and he was already moving for the stables. The road back through the border country took 3 days on the lower trail, which wound through the river valley instead of the ridge, with the Grelk running wide and fast to their south. They took it easy on the horses and talked for most of it, the way people talk when they've moved past performing and are just communicating, back and forth like a thing that runs on its own. He told her about the years of the road, the courts he'd played, the markets, a season on a river barge going south that he described as instructive in ways he hadn't expected. She told him about the first time she'd run a courier contract alone, 20 years old and entirely certain she was about to die in the Ashbone Pass, and how she had gotten through it by deciding she was more stubborn than the pass. "That tracks," he said. "I was right," she said. "I was considerably more stubborn." She told him about the clan, too, the one she'd left when she was 20, not in a way that asked for sympathy, but because he asked in the right way and she had said she would not hoard the true things. It was a mid-sized clan east of Calvrack, her mother's family mostly. She had left not because of conflict, but because she had wanted the road and the clan had wanted her to want something else, and they had both been right about what they wanted and unable to reconcile it. She still wrote to her mother. Her mother still wrote back. It was a manageable peace. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "I miss my mother," she said. "I miss the particular quality of a fire when there are 40 people around it." She thought about it. "I don't miss being told what I was for." He nodded. He understood that, she thought. The long road and the Lord's courts and always one town until the next, because the alternative was someone else deciding the shape of your life for you. "We're alike in that way," she said, "the choosing of the road." "We are," he said, "though I find I'm starting to want the road to go somewhere more specific." She looked at him. He was looking at the river. "Don't start making declarations on a horse," she said. "It's a poor venue." "Noted," he said, and he was smiling, and they rode. The second night on the lower trail, they camped by the river, and it was warm enough that they sat outside by the fire rather than inside the tent, with the stars coming out thick above the valley, and the river making its constant, unhurried sound below the bank. He played for a while, the lute again, the wordless kind, and then set it down and looked at her across the fire, and she looked back. "Come here," she said. It was not a request and not a command, just a statement of direction. He moved around the fire and sat beside her, and she leaned against him. She was built larger than him, taller by half a head, which she had never found awkward with him, only ordinary, and he put his arm around her and they sat like that with the fire and the river for a long time, and it was the best kind of quiet, the kind she had stopped expecting. She turned her face into his neck and he turned his face into her hair, and she felt him exhale slowly, all the way down, the kind of breath that's been held for a long time without knowing it. "This is good," he said, into her hair. "Yes," she said, into his neck. They stayed by the fire until the stars had wheeled well past midnight, and then she pulled him up and into the tent. And there in the warm dark with the river outside and no audience but the night, she showed him without words what she had been not saying since the bridge. And he met her at every point with the same open, unhurried, genuine care that he brought to everything. And it was not theatrical. It was just them, two people who had been alone on long roads deciding not to be. And she lay in the dark after with his arm across her and his breathing slow, and she felt settled, in the way of something arriving after being in motion for a very long time. She did not tell him that. She thought about telling him that. She decided to keep it for later when she was sure what words it required. She was going to need the right words. The morning arrived gold and crisp, and they were on the road again before the dew had lifted, and nothing between them had changed except everything. They reached Dustthorn 2 days later. The market was in full late-season swing, louder and more crowded than when they'd left, with traders trying to complete the last of their big contracts before the mountain passes closed for winter. Ugak delivered her iron return contract and collected her fee, and Daniel spoke to the market administrator, a different one than Pell. Apparently Pell had been replaced in the political upheaval following the discovery of the padded tolls, and came back with a new engagement for the Thornwall Festival, which was 3 weeks out and happening in the market square. They settled into the rhythm of Dustthorn together in a way that felt, uncomfortably and correctly, like a decision. She took a room at the North Side lodging house, with a window that looked over the market square. After 2 days, Daniel's things were also in the room, in the specific gradual way of two people not making a formal announcement about it, but letting it become true through accumulated fact. His loot case leaned against her saddle bags. His boots were by the hearth. The books he was always carrying had migrated onto the windowsill. She looked at the books one morning while he was downstairs getting breakfast, and she felt something that was not alarm, just its smaller cousin, the awareness of something changing in her world in a direction she had not planned. She had been very good at not planning for things like this. She had been very good at moving before roots could form. She was standing by the window when he came back in with bread and hard cheese and 2 cups of the good bitter morning tea they made in Dustthorn, and he set the cups down and looked at her standing there by his books at the window, and he said, "You all right?" "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She turned from the window. "I have been on the road for 6 years," she said. "I have been good at the road. I have been very clear with myself about what the road is for." He sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at her steadily and let her say the thing at whatever pace she needed. "I am not good at—" She stopped. She tried a different approach. "You cannot run a courier route and be invested in a fixed point," she said. "I have never had a fixed point." "I know," he said. "You have a son," she said. "You have a road of your own. We are both—" She gestured the complication of it. "This is not a simple arrangement." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I'm not asking you to be fixed, Ugak. I'm not asking you to choose between the road and this. I would not ask you to be less than you are." He paused. "I'm asking if you want to come back to the same fire when we've done our separate things. Not every night. Not in a way that stops you from being who you are. Just," he looked at her, clear and direct. "Just come back." She looked at him for a long time. "That is the most reasonable arrangement I have ever been offered," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "High praise. Do not push it, Weston." He raised his cup in a small toast, and she took her own cup and sat in the chair by the hearth, and the arrangement was made without more words than that, which was how the right agreements were made. The Thornwall Festival was 2 weeks away, and they had almost lost track of urgency when the ransom demand arrived. It came in a sealed letter to the market post, addressed to Daniel Weston, and Ugak was there when he opened it because they had been at the post collecting a contract together, and she saw his face go absolutely still. She took the letter from his hand when he didn't move for 5 seconds. It was from a man named Corvath, who ran a protection operation out of the Ashbone clan territory, not an Ashbone himself, a human opportunist who had spent 15 years building leverage in the border gap by making himself useful to whoever was in power and dangerous to everyone else. Corvath had, the letter said, Tam. He had collected the boy from the road between Calvrack and the post 2 days ago. He wanted 300 gold weight, which was a number large enough that it was not a casual demand. It was a calculated one designed to be devastating but theoretically achievable. He wanted it delivered to a location in the Ashbone Passa location that was, as Ugak immediately recognized, deep enough into Ashbone territory that any human rescue party would be stopped at the clan checkpoint, and far enough from any orc settlement that official orc intervention would be slow. He had given Daniel 10 days. Daniel was holding the letter again. She had given it back. His face was the face of a man running calculations as fast as he could. "The checkpoint," he said. "I can pass the checkpoint," she said. "I've done it twice." "Alone," he said, "with goods, not with 300 gold and a rescue." "No," she agreed, "not that way." She looked at the map in her head, the roads she knew, the faces she knew. "Brack," he looked at her. "Brack has trading relationships with 3 Ashbone families," she said. "He has been moving goods through that territory for 20 years. He would know which elder to approach." She was already thinking through the pieces. "We can't go through the checkpoint official. But the Ashbone are not Corvath's people there, just terrain he's using because it's convenient. If we can get an elder to pull Ashbone neutrality from him, he loses his position. And if we can't get there in time," Daniel's voice was controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it. "Then we go through the mountains another way," she said. "There's a trader's trail on the south side of the Ashbone Range that avoids the checkpoint. Difficult, possible." She met his eyes. "We are not going to let this happen." He looked at her for a moment, and this was the second time she had seen his face open completely, unguarded, and this time it was not the specific warmth of talking about his son's water wheel. It was something more fundamental, the look of a person who has been handed something they needed and was not sure they deserved it. 300 gold is, I don't have that, he said. Even with Brack's debt and my savings and everything I can raise in the market, pay what you have, she said. The rest is leverage. We talked to the elder first. She put her hand on his arm briefly, firm and certain. We ride for Calvrack today and we send word to Brack before we arrive. Move, Weston. He moved. They were on the road within the hour, pushing harder than the first trip. No appreciation for the scenery now, no camp conversation, just the road eating itself under the horses' hooves and the awareness of time on both sides of them. They made Calvrack in 2.5 days, pushing through the second night with torches and the moon, and Brack was waiting when they arrived because Ugak's message had ridden hard ahead on a post rider's horse, and Brack had the specific quality of a man who had been in enough desperate situations to recognize one arriving. Brack's face was serious. Corvath, he said, when Ugak had laid it out. I know Corvath. He's using the Ashbone checkpoint as cover, she said. Brack nodded slowly. Elder Marg would not like that. He looked at Daniel. The elder has pride about his territory. He does not enjoy being used as another man's terrain without agreement or payment. He drummed his fingers on the table. I can get you a meeting, not today, tomorrow morning early. Can you get word to Sella? Daniel asked. She'll need to know. Already sent, Brack said. He paused. She's holding together. She wants word the moment there's anything. Daniel nodded once tight. Right. That night was the hardest of all of them. Ugak sat with Daniel by the post's hearth long after the rest of the place had gone to sleep, and he did not sleep, only sat with his hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold and his eyes on the middle distance, and she did not say things that would not help. She sat beside him and she was there, which was what he needed, and she knew it was what he needed because she knew him now in the specific way of someone you have talked to by enough fires. At one point he said, "He builds things. He's going to be furious when we get him back." "Good," she said. "He'll want to build a lock system for every door he knows." "I'll help him," she said. He looked at her, and she met his eyes steadily, and he put his face in his hands for a moment and breathed. And when he came up he reached for her hand on the table, and she turned her palm up and let him hold it, and they sat like that until the coals faded. The meeting with Elder Marg happened at dawn in a structure at the edge of the Kalvrak post, in the neutral territory that the post represented. Marg was older than Ugak had expected, a small, dense, deeply weathered orc man, with the markings of a clan elder across his collarbone and eyes that had seen everything at least twice, and were not easily impressed. Brack made the introduction. Ugak laid out the situation in Orcish clearly and without embellishment because Elder Marg was the kind of man who would make his decisions faster without flourish. Marg listened. He asked one question: had Corveth paid the Ashbone for use of their territory? He had not. Marg was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Daniel. "Your boy," he said in the common tongue, accented but clear. "He is 8. "Yes, Elder," Daniel said. 8 is a serious age," Marg said. "Serious enough to be angry and too young to hide it." He looked at Ugak. "Grimtusk, your clan is Stoneback family originally." "My mother's line," she said, surprised. "I knew your mother," Marg said, 40 years ago. She argued with me about salt prices for an entire afternoon, and she was right." He looked back at Daniel. "Corveth used my territory without permission. This is an insult I do not accept." He stood. "I will send 4 riders to the location in the pass. They will remove the boy and bring Corveth before me. You will stay here." He looked at both of them. "This is clan business now." "With respect, Elder," Ugak said, "his father should be present when the boy is brought out." Marg looked at her for a moment. Then, "The father may come with my riders. He will do as they say." "Understood," Daniel said immediately. "Completely understood. Thank you, Elder." Marg left. Brack exhaled slowly. Ugak looked at Daniel and he looked at her, and she saw relief mixed with the remaining terror of not yet, of waiting for the thing to be done before it was real. "You knew his mother," Daniel said to her, a little breathless. "I did not know that," she said. She thought about it, Marg knowing her mother, the strange long reach of connections across this border country. "I'll tell her. She'll be smug about it." He laughed short and sharp, startled out of him, and she felt the tightness in her own chest ease a fraction. They rode with Marg's riders that afternoon, 4 orc warriors who treated Daniel with the polite indifference reserved for guests of the elder, and treated Ugak with the comfortable shorthand of shared language and clan protocol. The approach to the location in the pass went smoothly. The Ashbone riders knew their own territory, and the dark-end Corveth, who had clearly not been expecting clan involvement, had made the critical error of not having orc support. His men were human, hired, and they took one look at 4 Ashbone warriors approaching with the specific authority of an elder's mandate and made the rational decision. Tam was in a stone shelter at the back of a narrow valley. He was unharmed. Corveth had been a professional, if a criminal, wanting payment rather than harm. And when Daniel came through the shelter entrance, Tam launched himself off the bedroll and into his father with the force of a child who has been holding everything together for 2 days and has just been given permission to stop. Ugak stood at the entrance and watched Daniel hold his son with both arms, kneeling on the stone floor, his face pressed to the top of Tam's head, and she looked at the stars above the valley and felt, with absolute clarity, that this was the shape of the world she wanted. Not the specific shelter or the mountain air, but this. The people inside it, and her standing at the entrance making sure nothing else came through. After a moment, Tam pulled back from his father and looked around him with bright, furious eyes, cataloging the situation with the systematic intensity she recognized. Then he saw Ugak. "You came," he said. "Of course," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned back to his father and said, with the decisive practicality of a child who has processed the emergency and is now moving to action, "I have a plan for a better lock system. I'm going to need some iron and—" "Later," Daniel said, and his voice was rough, but his face was the face of a man who is about to cry from gratitude and is doing an excellent job of not doing it. "We're going to go home first. And then the lock system. And then the lock system." Tam looked at Ugak again. "Did you throw the rope?" "No rope this time," she said. "Just the riders. Just the riders and your father and a conversation about salt prices." She tilted her head. "It's a long story." He looked enormously interested. "Will you tell it on the way?" "Yes," she said. Corvath was bound and brought before Elder Marg the next day. Ugak did not attend that preceding it was clan jurisdiction, and she had no standing in it. But Brack reported later that Marg had been thorough and unambiguous, and that Corvath would not be doing business in Ashbone territory or any adjacent territory for the foreseeable future, which was a diplomatic way of saying what it actually meant. Sella arrived at the post to collect Tam, and her reaction to seeing him was less loud than Daniel's and no less complete. She looked at Ugak over Tam's head with an expression that was complex and honest, and she said, "I don't have the words," and Ugak said, "You don't need them," and that was accurate and enough. Tam spent 2 more days with Daniel before Sella took him back to Kalvrak, which gave Daniel time to be a father without the background noise of crisis, and Ugak spent part of that time teaching Tam what she had promised, more rope work, and also the basic mechanics of a lock, because she had some knowledge of that, and Tam deserved the real foundation if he was going to build the thing correctly. He was an excellent student. She told him so. He accepted it the way he accepted most things, as information to be filed and used. On the morning Sella and Tam left, standing in the post yard in the early light, Tam hugged his father and then turned to Ugak and looked at her with those bright, assessing eyes, and he said, quite deliberately, "I'm glad you're my dad's person." Ugak went still. Not the same stillness as the word beautiful. This was a different kind, slower and deeper. Not the sudden landing of something unexpected, but the arrival of something she had been moving toward and had just, in 8 words from an 8-year-old, arrived at. She looked at Daniel. He was looking at her. He had not arranged this. He had not prompted it. His expression was open and a little wrecked in the best way, and he was watching her with the specific care of someone who wants very much to know what she's going to do with the thing that just happened. She looked back at Tam. "I'm glad too," she said, and she meant it in a way that had no equivocation in it, no careful qualifier, no hedge for safety. She meant it the whole way down. Tam nodded, satisfied, and went with his mother, and they watched him go, and Daniel stood beside her in the post yard and said nothing for a moment, just stood close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching. "He's not wrong," Daniel said eventually. "No," she said. "He's usually not." He turned to look at her fully. "Ugak." "Weston," she said, and her voice was level, but she could feel the warmth of what was happening in it, the specific warmth of something irreversible and correct. "I love you," he said. Not a prologue to it, not a build. Just the thing itself, direct and unhurried. She looked at him for a moment with the full weight of 6 years on the road and the specific loneliness of being too competent to ask for company. And then she said, "I know," which was not what she meant, and she knew it was not what she meant, and he could tell it was not what she meant either, because he waited. "I love you too," she said, and it was considerably less difficult to say than she had been expecting, because the truth of things rarely is once you've decided to say them. He put his hand on her face-open palm, warm against her jaw, and she turned her face into it briefly, the smallest animal motion, and then stepped back because they were in a yard and she had her dignity. He smiled. He understood. They rode back to Dusthorn 3 days later with the Thornwall Festival a week ahead, and the road was the same road they had ridden before, the lower trail, the river valley, the long way. But everything about it was different, or rather, everything about how they rode it was different, because they were no longer two people who were pretending that they were just in proximity. They were two people who knew what they were to each other, and the road felt different when you knew where you were going back to. The Thornwall Festival was the largest celebration in the market district, 3 days of trading and music and public competition, and it drew people from both sides of the Grelk human merchants and orc traders, and every shade of person in between in the specific forced proximity that caused either conflict or fellowship, and usually managed both. On the first evening of the festival, Daniel played in the main hall. Ugak sat at the back again, same as the first time, same cup of cider, except that this time it was not a private appreciation at a distance but an acknowledged thing. And the woman at the next table who gave her a look when she sat down got a look back that was the specific look that ended looks, and then she turned to face the stage and did not concern herself with it. He was extraordinary. He was always extraordinary, but on the first festival night he was something more than his usual standard. The crowd was larger, the energy higher, and he played into it and off it and under it with the skill of someone who had been doing this for 15 years and still genuinely loved it. He played 3 instrumental pieces and then 2 stories, and the second story was the one about the destroyed bridge and the 2 people from opposite sides of the war, except that the version he told tonight was different from the version he'd told on the first night, and when she heard it she understood why. In the original version, the 2 people looked at each other across the ruins of the bridge, and then the story ended ambiguous, which was the kind of ending that was satisfying in a literary way. In tonight's version, they both stepped into the broken middle and found, somehow, there was enough of it to stand on. When the hall emptied and the crowd dispersed into the festival night, she found him at the edge of the stage putting the lute in its case, and she said, "You changed the ending." He snapped the case closed. "I did. Is it the right ending?" "I think so," he said. "I think it's the true one." She looked at him. The festival lanterns were hung along the hall's open sides, and the night air outside was carrying music from other stages, 3 or 4 different songs mixing together in the pleasant chaos of a celebration. "Good," she said. He stood and shouldered the lute case and held out his hand, and she looked at it for a moment. His hand extended in the festival hall, visible, uncomplicated, asking her nothing she hadn't already answered, and she put her hand in his. They walked out of the hall into the square, into the full noise and light of the Thornwall Festival, with the market laid out around them and the lanterns strung between the stalls and the traders and travelers, and half the population of the border district all moving in the cheerful, complicated dance of a good festival night. Some people looked. A few stared. One man near the east gate said something to the woman beside him, and the woman shushed him with the specific expression of someone who had no time for it, and Ugak looked at the man briefly, not hostile, just present, and he looked away. Daniel did not look at the people who stared. He was looking at the festival, at the stalls, at the lanterns, at her when he turned to say something about a vendor selling spiced nuts that smelled genuinely good, and did she want some? "Yes," she said. He bought 2 paper cones of spiced nuts from a cheerful stall keeper who smiled at both of them without commentary, and they walked through the festival eating spiced nuts and talking about nothing in particular, and the evening opened around them into the particular quality of a festival night that becomes one of those nights you remember as a whole color-warm and lit and full and specifically yours. On the second day of the festival, there was a public competition in the market square. Various physical contests, archery, rope pull, the throwing competition that every market festival seemed to require regardless of location. Ugak was not planning to enter any of them, but she was watching the rope throw from the edge of the crowd when the organizer, scanning for entrants, caught her eye and said with the practiced cheer of someone who wanted a good show, What about you, then? We've got prize coin for the longest accurate throw." She looked at the target. She looked at the crowd. She was aware of Daniel, 3 feet to her right, carefully not saying anything, and she was aware that entering a public competition at a human-run festival as an orc woman was the kind of thing that was either a statement or trouble or both. She stepped forward and took the rope. The crowd shifted. She felt the quality of the attention change, more focused, more loaded, and she coiled the rope in her hands with the familiar motion, the one she had done 1,000 times on 100 roads, and she looked at the target, 40 feet out, and breathed. She threw. The lead hit the center peg with a sound that was audible across the square. Silence for one moment, then a single voice. A young man near the front started it, and the sound spread, and it was applause, real and loud, and from the people around her who were at this festival to see something good happen. And she stood with the rope in her hands and felt it wash over her, and it was fine. More than fine. Daniel was grinning. She could see it in her peripheral vision without looking, that open, delighted grin. She did not grin back because she had her dignity. But she handed the rope back to the organizer with a nod, and when she returned to her position at the edge of the crowd, she stood close enough to Daniel that their arms touched, and she stayed there. He found her hand and held it, right there in the middle of the festival square, and no one interfered, and the world did not end. And the organizer announced her as the winner with a clear, neutral voice, and the crowd clapped again. She collected the prize coin, a modest but respectable amount, and put it in her vest, and a woman with 2 children came over and said her daughter had been watching and wanted to learn, and could she say anything about technique. And she talked with the woman for a few minutes and heard Daniel behind her talking to the market factor about his upcoming contract. And she felt the dual reality of it, her world and his world, intersecting and overlapping in the loud light of the festival square. And it was not a strange feeling, it was a good one. That evening, after the second day of the festival closed and the market square emptied out into the taverns and lodging houses, they sat on the ledge above the square, a stone rail on the second floor of the market hall, overlooking the lights below, and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the festival winding down, the late traders closing their stalls, the lanterns being drawn in one by one. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "The winter roads close in 6 weeks," she said. "Most of my East Side contracts dry up until spring." She was quiet for a moment. "I have enough saved to winter somewhere fixed." He looked at her. She looked at the square. "Aldenmore has a winter market," he said, carefully neutral. "Smaller than Dustthorn, but a market." "It does," she said. "It has a decent lodging house on the south side," he said. 2 rooms or 1 depending on the arrangement. "One would be more economical," she said. Significantly, she looked at him. He was trying not to look too pleased, which was a losing battle. "My mother lives in Aldenmore," he said. "She will absolutely ask you 16 questions about everything." "I can manage 16 questions. She'll ask more after that." "Weston," she said. "Yes. I am an orc courier who has managed every situation this border country has produced for 6 years," she said. "I can manage your mother." He looked at her for a long, warm moment. "God, I love you," he said, and it was still the same simple, unhurried thing, and she still had the same instinct to deflect it, and she still chose not to. "I know," she said, and then, because she was not a person who owed her feelings to anyone but chose to give them freely to those who deserved it, "I love you too, every time, not just the once." He kissed her there on the ledge above the festival square, with the last of the lanterns still lit below them and the night air coming off the mountains clean and cold. And it was the same as the first kiss in the post yard, firm and warm and entirely meant. And she put her hand on the back of his neck and kept him there a moment longer, because she could, and because she wanted to, and both of those things were exactly as good as they should be. The third and final day of the Thornwall Festival was its biggest, the formal market competitions, the official trader negotiations, the seasonal contract signings that determined who was moving what through which road in the spring. Ugak spent the morning doing what she was there to do. She negotiated 3 spring contracts with 2 different merchants, and one of the Kalvrak traders she had met at the post, her rates sharp and her reputation speaking for itself in the way it had built to over 6 years. She signed those contracts in the market administrator's office with the new administrator watching a careful, efficient woman named Das who ran things considerably more honestly than Pell, and she signed them as Ugak Grimtusk, Blade Courier, North Grelk Border, and the rates she named were exactly what she was worth. Then she went back out into the festival square. The closing ceremony of the Thornwall Festival was, by tradition, a public acknowledgement of the season's trade, who had moved goods, which partnerships had held, which new agreements had been made. The market administrator stood on the square's raised platform and read them out, and the market crowd gathered to hear, because in this world the names you did business with were public, and the naming of them was a form of respect. Das read the contracts in alphabetical order. When she came to Ugak's name, she read it clearly and without hesitation into the square. Ugak Grimtusk, 3 contracts, north and east routes, spring season. And the traders who had signed with her were standing near the platform, and they nodded, and the crowd registered it, and that was all it needed to be. Daniel was at the edge of the platform area with his loot case, because the closing ceremony traditionally ended with music, and he was the contracted entertainment. She found him there and stood beside him while the rest of the names were read, and he leaned over quietly and said, "Spring contracts." 3 of them, she said. "Good routes." "Very good routes, so you'll be in the border district come spring." "I will," she said, "and the winter lodging in Aldenmore." "Already arranged," she said. It was true, she had spoken to the lodging house keeper that morning, 1 room, reasonable rate, quiet south side. He looked at her with that expression, the warm, certain, not performing one, and he said, "You know what this means." "It means I have a winter address," she said. "It means you're staying," he said, and there was nothing triumphant in it, just recognition, just the plain fact of a thing they had both chosen arriving at the place it was always going. "For the winter," she said, "and the spring routes." "Obviously, and presumably the summer, given that the east routes are good in summer." "Presumably," she said. He smiled slowly and fully. "Ugak. Weston," she said. "Thank you," he said, and she knew exactly what he meant by it, and she did not look away. "Don't thank me," she said. "I am doing this for the economical lodging rate." "Of course," he said, completely straight-faced. "And possibly for you," she added, and the corner of her mouth moved. Then Das called his name from the platform, Daniel Weston, festival musician. And he picked up his loot case and went up, and she stood in the square in the full afternoon light of the closing festival day with the crowd around her, and the mountains rising to the east and the Grelk glinting silver at the valley's edge. And she felt, with the specific clarity of a thing finally and fully arrived at, good. He played the closing ceremony with the ease and pleasure of someone doing the exact right thing in the exact right moment. And the crowd was warm and responsive. And the sun came down at the particular angle it gets in late afternoon at the end of a good festival day. And everything was exactly as it was, which was fine and true and enough. When he finished and came down from the platform, she was where she had said she would be, at the east side of the square by the water trough, the one practical fixed point in the moving festival crowd. And he came to her directly, not to anyone else, not to the crowd who wanted a word or the administrator who had a question, but to her, and he always would. She understood this now, because this was who they were. She was fierce until his son called her beautiful, and something in her had opened then that she had not known was closed, and she had held that for weeks before she understood what it was. Not the word itself, but the absence of the weight behind it, the impossible lightness of being seen by eyes that hadn't learned yet to see with any agenda but the truth. And she had opened further, and she was still opening, and she had decided she was still deciding, and she always would be, that this was worth every mile of the hard road it had taken to get here. She stood in the festival square and let him come to her, and when he reached her she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything because neither of them needed to. Then she said, "If we ride out before dark we can make the first rest stop by the river before the cold comes in." "The horses are ready," he said. "Your loot, already packed." "Then let's go," she said, and they went. The road out of Dusthorn ran south and west toward Aldenmore, following the valley of the Grelk until it bent and broadened, and the foothills gave way to the longer, more settled country of the human lowlands, where the farms spread out, and the village lights came on at dusk in the distance. It was a good road, well kept and wide enough for two horses side by side, and they rode it in the last of the afternoon light with the festival sounds fading behind them and the winter coming on slow and certain ahead. She could feel the cold in the air already, the specific cold that had mountains in it, the kind that told you what was coming in clear and uncomplicated terms. She had ridden into 6 winters on the border road. She had ridden out of all of them. This one she was riding into with someone beside her, which was new, and was the right new thing. She would write to her mother from Aldenmore. She would tell her about Elder Marg knowing the salt prices argument 40 years ago, and her mother would be smug about that and then ask 17 questions of her own about Daniel. She would answer them honestly, or most of them, or enough of them to give her mother the shape of the thing. She would run her spring contracts east when the passes opened, and Daniel would be at the market or the lodging house or the road wherever she needed him to be, and she would come back to the same fire, as agreed, as promised, as freely chosen every time. Tam would build his lock system. She would help him get the iron weight right. She was, exactly what she had always been, which was fierce and capable and unwilling to be less than herself. And she was also this, a person who had let someone see her clearly and had seen him clearly in return, and had decided that was worth staying for. The last light caught the river below the road, turning it gold for about 30 seconds the way it did at this angle, and Daniel said, "Look at that," the way he said things he found beautiful, simple, and direct, and she looked and said, "Yes," and they rode on. The road kept going. The light kept changing. The Grelk ran south below them, carrying the snowmelt of the high mountains down to the sea. Above the valley, the first stars appeared at the edge of the dark curly, insistent, and the air smelled of pine and cold stone, and the particular clean sharpness that the border country always had in late season, and she breathed it in and let it settle. She was not afraid of what was ahead. She was not afraid of the winter, or the road, or the lodging house with 1 room or his mother's 16 questions. She was not afraid of the spring contracts, or the summer roads, or the slow, ongoing, chosen work of building something that lasted with a person who deserved it. She had been afraid of exactly one thing, for a long time, the specific loneliness of being too capable to need anyone and too honest to pretend she didn't want to. And that fear had lived in her like a cold coal, and it was not there anymore. Daniel looked over at her in the dusk, the way he did, that clear and unhurried look, and she met it without deflecting, and he said nothing, just looked, and then they both looked back at the road. The road ahead was long and fine and going somewhere specific, and they were going there together, and that was the shape of the life, and it was a good one. She was fierce and she was loved, and she knew both things were true at the same time, which was the only way it should be.